Hi there, my name is Lily, and right now I am 29. I have discovered the hard way that occasionally the people you love most can be the ones most likely to inflict the worst damage on you. But let me begin from the start. Back when things were straightforward, when I had the love of two parents looking after me, life was simple growing up. I lived in a cozy house, had a dad who would tell the funniest stories, and a mother who constantly smiled. Sunday mornings were holy in our house. Early on, I woke up and smelt pancakes coming from the kitchen. While my mother hummed in the background making the syrup, my dad would be standing there grinningly turning them. I valued those most among the times. When it all changed, I was 6 years old. The day I woke up and discovered my father still and pallid in a hospital bed will never be forgotten. A coronary attack. That is all the physicians stated. Not a warning. No indication existed. Simply left. At first, my mom attempted to hold everything together for me, but I could see the gaps beginning to show. She broke in a way I could not comprehend, and she never was the same no matter how hard I tried to reach her. I had assumed we would settle into a new normal, but just 1 year after Dad died, she ran into Richard. Richard was not a nasty man. Actually, I believe he tried sincerely. He treated my mom with a tenderness I had never seen her get, and was friendly and patient. Though I wanted to like him, I couldn't get rid of the impression that he was merely a placeholder, a means for my mother to cover the void left by Dad. Richard joined our life permanently not too long later, and he arrived with Tommy, his son from a past marriage. Though Tommy was a few years my junior, I could tell immediately that he was not like me. Tommy was loud, demanding, and, truthfully, a bit of a brat. He had no trouble attracting my mother's attention. She handed it to him without thinking twice. Once he came into our life, my place in the family seemed to be erasing. Tommy started to draw all the attention, and I was left on the sidelines observing as my mother turned just to him. Though at first I didn't comprehend it, I soon saw that Tommy dominated everything. He did not have to clean his room, try in school, or even assist with the dishes. Still, he always got what he wanted somehow. I recall the first time I felt really invisible. To be precisely, it was my birthday, my 12th birthday. For it, I got really enthusiastic. I took days selecting a cake and a little present for myself. Though I knew my mother was juggling Richard and Tommy, I couldn't help wishing she would remember me that day. Tommy was sick that morning instead, and my mother stayed with him all day. From her, I hardly even received a happy birthday. She told me we could celebrate tomorrow, handing me a card with hardly a grin when she eventually came from his room in the evening. There never was the celebration. I started to learn to fend for myself from that point ahead. I stopped thinking things would be different and stopped calling for attention. Tommy had already asserted his position as the golden child. No matter how hard I tried to be the nice daughter, I was always second best. Naturally, Richard tried. It was him who sensed my suffering and tried to close the void. He helped me in school, made sure I got into a decent institution, and paid for my packing and relocation expenses when it was time to head off for university. Still, I could see the strain in his eyes even as he encouraged me. His efforts to reach Tommy proved fruitless. Tommy never took anything seriously and never listened to him. Still, my mother stood Tommy's defender at every turn. I knew I was leaving by the time I graduated from high school. I obliged. Living under the same roof as someone who considered me as nothing more than a shadow would be intolerable. I wanted somewhere where I could be myself, away from continual Tommy comparison. My ticket out was admission to Marshall University, and I experienced a freedom I had never known before, first of its kind in years. But part of me felt bad as I started to pack. Guilt at having to part from my mother, guilt for leaving her when she was obviously struggling. Still, what decision did I have to make? I could not continue to live like this, always disregarded and underused. It was time for me to start running my life, even if it meant divorcing the family I had once loved. My shelter turned out to be Marshall University. I threw myself into my studies, worked part-time at a cafe, and befriended fresh people. Though not glittering, it was mine. It was my life. And for the first time in years, I felt like I fit somewhere. But things just grew worse back at home. Tommy's actions descended into anarchy. He left high school early, turned down a job, and spent much of his time either hanging around with pals or gaming. All of this notwithstanding, my mother kept shielding him from any fallout. She may claim, Tommy's just going through a phase, or he's trying his best, but I knew better. Tommy was not attempting. His mother was helping him. He was coasting. Richard sent me information on ongoing. He confided in me his frustration at Tommy not changing no matter what he did. For my mother, though, it was irrelevant. She saw just her son, and in her view, he could not do anything wrong. Once I graduated, I expected to at last feel as though I had broken free. But the ghost of my family tormented me long after I moved into my first apartment and started working for a consulting company. I could never get away from the sense that I wasn't enough for my mother, that she had never really seen me for who I was, no matter how far away I traveled. To exacerbate things, I never received her backing. She only called to inquire about Tommy. Even as I developed my career and found success, she would tell me how much harder it was for Tommy, how he still needed her when I visited home. She hardly would recognize my achievements. She could forget about me as long as Tommy needed her, as though I had become alien to her. Ultimately, I had to come to terms with something terrible. I was not the daughter her ideal would have been. Tommy was, and I watched from the sidelines of their ideal small family. I couldn't live this way going forward. I had to go, but as I stood on the brink of that choice, I couldn't help but wonder, would she ever see me for who I really was? Though in a sense, I was also leaving behind the final traces of a family that had never really seen me. Leaving for college felt like I was escaping years of feeling invisible. I began to lead a life totally my own at Marshall University. At last, I was in a location where I could be whoever I wanted to be, free from continual self-evaluation versus Tommy, and free from advocating for my mother's attention. Though the pressure was great, it felt different. I studied hard, juggling job and school. I took control. Something I had not been able to feel at home for years. I felt proud of myself, but the reality about my family, about the way I had been shoved aside, forgotten, and neglected, kept chewing at me even as I flourished in my own life. My mother never phoned to find out how my classes were going or whether I was doing okay. She never followed up with me as she used to when I was a child. Though I knew Tommy was not helping himself, all her attention was on him. Tommy remained the same as the previous time I paid a visit home over a break. Still living off the leftovers of my mother's love, he hadn't even tried to hunt for a job. Before she was grumbling about Tommy being struggling and needing more of her attention, I had hardly even passed through the door. Hearing it had become old to me. Her defending of him wearied me, and even more so was the way she had written me off totally. I realized that my achievements mattered nothing to her, not because they were unimpressive, but rather because I had grown up and no longer required her permission. Tommy and his shortcomings dominated everything, and she was more than ready to ignore. Every time I visited, the thought ached. The distance between us widened. Moving into my own apartment, shopping for furnishings, beginning to run my life, my mom's actions began to feel more like a betrayal as I kept developing my profession after college. I was following her exactly, going to college, landing a decent career, and starting my own life. But none of it seemed to count to her since none of it included Tommy. Like they didn't matter in relation to his, my achievements were invisible. Her focus would always return to Tommy every time I tried to tell her about a project I had worked on, or a promotion. She would want to know whether I had discussed it with him, why he wasn't doing better, and whether he had yet secured a job. I had tried to be a decent daughter all my life. I always followed the rules, remained out of trouble, and worked hard. And yet, no matter how much I accomplished or how hard I fought to create something of myself, it felt like I was merely background noise to the true drama of Tommy's life. If deep down, I still yearned for her approval, even if I told myself I no longer needed it, I still yearned for her to see me, for her to know that I had earned the life I had by effort. But I found myself slinking farther away from her every time she turned her back on me to concentrate on Tommy. Richard paid me a call one day. The only one still periodically checking in on me was him. Overall, he had been encouraging even if my mother had been aloof. He informed me that my mother felt overburdened by everything and was not doing well. He described Tommy's continued refusal to find employment, his mowing off of her, and his running up of expenses with acquaintances. Nothing seemed to have changed, and I started to wonder why I should be concerned anymore. When Richard inquired whether I might visit, I could sense his irritated voice. Though part of me knew it wouldn't make a difference, I consented. Not one thing had changed when I arrived. Tommy was, as usual, In his room, engaged in video game play, half consciously attempting to keep things together, my mother was in the kitchen, clearly unhappy. She had aged so much in the past few years, and I could feel the tiredness in her eyes. But when she looked at me, the same disengagement still prevailed. She was not particularly seeing me. I felt as though I was not her daughter, but rather a far relative. She mentioned just how much Tommy needed her, and how challenging everything had gotten, hardly acknowledging my presence. I wanted to be a part of her life once more, so I tried to chat with her and let her know I was here to help. She was not listening, though. She lost all hearing of me. Tommy was her first concern. I was simply a need she had to fulfill in her life. As if I lacked my own bills to handle, she even requested I assist Tommy with his auto maintenance. I wanted to yell at her, tell her I wasn't her ATM, that I wasn't going to keep Tommy's sloth under control, but instead I nodded and handed her the money. I was leaving. I could not keep on doing it. I seemed to be shrinking every time I entered that house. How much I could give, how much I could sacrifice for Tommy, defined my value, but I got less the more I offered. For what reason was I being drained? Constant validation of Tommy by my mother? I could not continue to be the dutiful daughter who was always passed over. That day, I went out. It was the first time in years I had not turned around. The weight dropped from my chest as I got into my car and headed out. I felt freer and lighter. It never would be. Hence, I had to stop acting as though my mother's love was something I could get. I came to see then that I would never be sufficient for her no matter how much I provided. No matter how hard I tried, Tommy would be first. That was the instant I realized I could rely just on myself. I had to quit looking to someone who would never see me for who I really was for approval. Though it hurt, it also released something. At last, I was going to take charge of my life. No more waiting for love or approval that would never arrive. I was done with that version of my family and with invisibility. Time to live my life for me. Years of pushing through the anguish of being invisible in my own family finally seemed to be allowing life to give me time to catch my breath. Following an honors graduation from Marshall University, I found a consultancy position. Though it was a start, one that seemed like a little triumph following all I had gone through, it was hardly the dream job I had envisioned as a child. I moved into a tiny apartment, a place totally mind-free from the stifling dynamics of my mom's house. Still, something about it all felt unfinished, even with the fresh beginning. Leaving home seemed to solve everything, that I could at last get away from the constant comparisons to Tommy, the sense of second place. Actually, though, it helped me to recognize how much I still yearned for my mother's praise. She wasn't interested, even though I was out there living my life and excelling in ways I hadn't imagined possible. It was always the same. Every phone call and every trip home. Tommy's doing? How is he coping with life following dropout? Is he still hanging about with his buddies? As if I no longer existed in her universe, my mom would ask these questions. Not one congrats for my achievements. Ignorance of the diligence I would have put in. While Tommy stayed the focus of her universe, I started to fade in her life. I told myself repeatedly that it made no difference. Right then, I was establishing my future, and that was what counted. Deep down, though, I understood it was more complicated than that. I wanted my mother to see me, to be proud of me, to love me as she loved Tommy, but she never did. It was the weight of obligation I felt toward her. Not alone, the emotional neglect that sapped me. She would call every few months, and each time the explanation was, Tommy needed something. She constantly required me to cover for Tommy. She never inquired about my life, whether it was money for his most recent emergency, guidance on how to support him after he got in hot water, or just listening to her rant about how challenging it was to deal with him. It always came down to me being the one who had to keep things together. Richard was no more of a help. Though worn out, he was a decent man. Though he had tried everything to assist Tommy, it was like hammering his head against a brick wall. Tommy was quite adept at manipulation. Sadly, she always fell for it, as he understood just how to touch my mom's heartstrings. Tommy could not do anything wrong in her view, and I, well, was only there to gather the fragments when things naturally went wrong. Spending more time concentrating on my profession and developing my own life started me to feel as if I was living in two distinct worlds. In one, I was a successful, self-reliable lady. In the other, I remained Lily, always second place behind Tommy, always the one expected to help, always the one cleaning the messes. Tommy's sloth and lack of accountability finally caught up with him in a significant manner, and it marked a breaking point. One evening, my mother called, and her voice quivering with terror. Tommy once more had been in legal hot water. This time, it was not something minor. He was at major risk, having breached certain rules and accumulated debt. Naturally, too, my mother came to me for assistance, her voice heavy with desperation. "Lily," she continued, "I don't know what to do. Only you are the one qualified to speak with him. She needs you." Tommy did not need me, really. He had to deal with the results of his acts. Instead of stating that, though, I discovered I was once more the conscientious one, though deep down I knew that helping him would just serve to perpetuate the cycle we had been caught in for years, so I agreed to talk to him in an attempt to cool my mother down. I recall sitting across from Tommy, who was resting on the couch in my mom's living room, as though nothing was wrong. He looked the same, smugly, the one that indicated he expected me to make everything right for him. It started my blood to boil. With a shaky voice, "Tommy," I added, "this isn't something I can fix for you. You must begin to own your behavior. You cannot continue to use Mom, using me, to tidy your mess." His expression contorted in imitation surprise. He sneered at me. "You think you're better than me, Lily? Not so sure. You might criticize me only because your life is organized. You are incorrect, though. You have not had to battle as I have." I wanted to give him a smack. While he sat back and did nothing, I wanted to shout at him and tell him I had battled, that I had worked more than everyone else to make anything of myself. Rather, though, I inhaled deeply and left since I knew fighting with him would have no effect. That evening when I returned to my flat, I was depressed, yet also angry. Tommy's sloth, entitlement, and ongoing manipulation of our mother infuriated me. Having spent so many years trying to grab her attention, win her love, and gain her approval, only to find that no matter what I did, I would never be enough for her, made me depressed, and it struck me right away, and then later. I had no need for her clearance. Tommy's approval wasn't what I needed. I came to see for the first time in my life that my own approval was the only one I required. That evening, I decided I was done. I stopped being the fixer and stopped always picking up the pieces. I was done trying to carve out a spot for me in a family devoid of room. I would not allow their poisonous, draining actions to define my existence. Years of hoping that if I just worked more, accomplished more, they would at last see me would pass. But I came to see then that their view of me would never alter. And it was not my problem, theirs was. Standing in front of the mirror in my flat, I vowed to myself, no more. Look at your reflection. My happiness, peace, and life, those would be mine to determine going forward. Neither Tommy nor my mother, nor anybody else, would take that away, that from me once more. It was time for me to begin living for myself instead of hiding behind shadows. And I felt free, for the first time in a long time. 2 years had elapsed since my college graduation. I had created a life just for me, one that I alone owned. I developed relationships, worked hard, and came to enjoy the things I had always lacked in my youth. I was autonomous, self-sufficient, and pleased with my progress. Still, in the back of my mind, I felt the residual guilt over not being there for my mother or doing enough to help her following Richard's death. I had ceased attempting to call. I had not heard much from home throughout this period. I had discovered the hard way that my mother just thought of Tommy and showed little interest in the person I had grown to be. Everything seemed to change when Richard passed away. Tommy's status as the needy one grew even more clear when my mother broke down, but I was tired of bearing their emotional load. I had to pay myself top attention until the phone call arrived, the one I never would have expected. It was my mother, clearly agitated. "Lily, I need your help," she continued, voice shaking. "I do not know what to do. I cannot now make ends meet. The bills. Everything is stacking up." My chest dropped. Her voice revealed desperation that suggested things had only grown worse. Still, some of me wanted to say no. Having struggled so hard to escape their poisonous hold, here she was calling for assistance. Still, there was residual remorse, that same guilt that had kept me back previously. She had nowhere else to turn, as I knew. Tommy most definitely wasn't going to be of assistance, and I couldn't leave her to fight by herself. Like I had done in past years while Richard was still living, I agreed to send her $1,500 a month. Though I wanted not to, I did it since I was the only one she could count on. Tommy did nothing. It was always the same story. He didn't even care, let alone work or participate. Nevertheless, my mother kept defending him regardless of his sloth or irresponsibility. Every call and every visit simply made me feel smaller, invisible once more. Every time I went home, it was as though I had entered a parallel universe. I watched while my mother, still coddling Tommy, treated him like a child, but it was more than just that. What truly burnt was my continued treatment like an outsider within my own family. It made no difference whether I paid the bills and kept a roof over their heads or worked nonstop. Tommy was clearly the major focus for my mother, and I felt as though I was merely enabling them the more I attempted to help. Now 22, Tommy had gained weight, quit going to college completely, and turned down a job offer. He spent money carelessly, hung out with pals, and engaged in video game play without considering the repercussions. Still, in her denial, my mother couldn't see it. She would always say, "He's just having a tough time," or "He's still figuring it out," with no end of justification. I got another call from my mother one evening while reviewing some paperwork at my apartment. This time, everything changed. She was not seeking financial support. She wanted something that would really break me. "Lily, I have to tell you something," she said. Her voice detached. My stomach contracted. "What is it, Mom?" She stopped then to add, "I have decided." I corrected my will. "Tommy will inherit whatever I have left behind when I pass go." Freeze. I stopped short from breathing. My heart thumping in my chest, the world appeared to slow down. I could hardly generate a cogent argument. What are you referring to?" At last, I stammered. The words felt alien as they left my mouth. "I have always trusted Tommy the most," my mum said, her tone matter of fact. "He's the one I've always believed in." "You are autonomous, Lily. You have lived your own life. Tommy depends on me more. He needs someone to mentor him." It surprised me. Having worked hard all my life to prove I was deserving of her love and acceptance, I discovered at last I was merely a backup. Tommy had always favored and been the one she really loved, the one she considered to be the better child. Nothing was spoken by me. I unable could. All at once I was shocked, numb, and outraged. Still, the next piece that really broke me was Tommy has always been loved by me more than Lily. Real family for me is him. Her comments really smacked like a ton of bricks. Each phrase sank farther, verifying what I had dreaded and suspected for years, like a knife turning in my heart. It had never been sufficient. Whatever I had done or how much I had given up, I didn't shed tears. I was unable. I just hung up the phone and sat there in shocked silence, her betrayal weighing on me like a black cloud. I'd finished. I discovered for the first time in my life that I had nothing left to give this family. I packed and left early the following morning. I turned around, not looking back. I did not want to. I felt the weight lightening off my shoulders for the first time in years. The obedient daughter who was always there to pick up the pieces was no more someone I wanted to portray. I was finished with the never-ending loop of being treated as though I didn't matter, and with the continual letdown. I quit sending money. I blocked their numerical value. I totally cut them out from my life. I am not feeling guilty anymore. I have again taken back my independence. Tommy's and my mother's might never get what I accomplished. I no longer need their approval, even if they might never see the suffering they caused me. I now understand that their approbation defines nothing about my value. I have come to stand on my own, free from their hollow affection or continual critique. And every time I pass that help wanted sign, every time I consider Tommy, every job position comes to mind. Now, though, when I think of him, I merely smile. Knowing that his issues, mistakes, are no more weight for me to bear, I am not bound. I have my life. That is plenty. The phone call arrived barely a few years later, following my ultimate adaptation into my own rhythm, one I had been fearing yet knew was approaching somehow always. Shaky and disturbed, Richard informed me my mother had phoned him in a panic. Tommy was in trouble, she claimed, having gotten a letter from her attorney. Not only in trouble, but in major, life-altering trouble. My first assumption was that it had to do with his lack of ambition, possibly some small financial error or something. But Richard told me it was even worse in his rage and grief. Tommy had become somehow embroiled in a financial fraud involving family investments. I first wanted not to believe it. Tommy? The golden child of my mother, the one she had always cradled and shielded. The child who couldn't even land a job stumbled into the heart of a plot meant to destroy him, and hence her as well. The truth knocked me like a ton of bricks. But it wasn't only the news of Tommy's behavior that startled me. No, it was the fact that my mother was once more requesting my help in bail for him. She called me for assistance, bold enough, as if I still were the dependable, always available daughter who would repair everything for her. She was now expecting me to swoop in and save Tommy, the one who had never been held responsible for anything, after all I had gone through and after being the one who had been left behind for years. That Saturday, when I got to her place, the air was charged with conflict. Tommy stood in the living room, his typical haughtiness replaced with something I had never seen in him before: fear. He appeared for the first time like a young person unsure of how to negotiate the fallout from his own behavior. Already discussing how the family needed to get together to mend this, my mother was in the kitchen pacing back and forth and wringing her hands. I hardly could look at her. She could still defending him? How could she still deny seeing what he was? She wanted me to undo everything he had destroyed now. My own wrath erupted inside me. Though it wasn't easy, I attempted to remain cool. As I asked her, "How could you let him do this?" I battled to keep my voice steady. "How could you not be seeing this approaching?" As usual, my mother had an answer. She attributed all of this to Richard's absence and to Tommy's extreme stress level. She chastised me for not being around more to help Tommy when he needed it. Her comments sliced like glass, each one reminding me of all the years I had spent giving myself up for someone who would never be appreciative. I'm done. Done with being the conscientious one. Done with always being the one who showed up. For so long, my mother had controlled me. I felt bad for not adoring Tommy the way she did. But regarding me, what about all the times I had offered this family? My time, my heart, my energy, and had nothing but disappointment in return. I decided then it was time to head out. Time to let go of the illusory expectation that one day I would at last be sufficient for her. I told her it was time she faced the results of her own choices since I could no longer help. Tommy's eyes blazed with the old entitlement, the same look he usually had when he was enraged but knew he had no authority. My mother's brow wrinkled in incredulity, but I no longer gave a damn. I would not be their rescuer. Leaving behind all the shame and all the weight of their expectations, I walked out of the house. I felt as though I had made the correct choice. First in years, though that wasn't simple. It never is when you cut off relations with family, even poisonous ones. But relief swept over me as I drove off. I ceased having to correct them. I spared myself from bearing their weight on my shoulders. And I had no need to apologize for being the person they had never valued. I was free. First in my life. Life did not get simpler straight away once I decided to distance myself from my mother and Tommy. It was dirty, agonizing, and occasionally lonely. But as the days went by, I started to feel free. A sensation I had not noticed I was yearning for. Their worries no longer had weight for me. For the first time in years, I could at last breathe without feeling crushed under their demands and machinations. At first, it was not easy. Sometimes I would find myself inclined to follow in on them to see whether Tommy had created another mess I could clean. I still carried the old tendency of being the one to mend problems and rescue. Still, I reminded myself every time that I no longer owned them. I had no weight to carry from them. Still, the silence from my mother proved to be the toughest challenge. Periodically, she would text me, guilt-tripping me for cutting her out of my life. I never answered when she messaged Tommy about his difficulties, urging me to just do something, as he was so lost. Though I knew that answering would simply bring me back into the same unhealthy relationship I had spent years trying to escape, I could feel the old pull of guilt in my chest. Tommy never personally contacted me, but I knew he was still doing his regular ruses. Stories of his continuous pranks, sloth, and avoidance of growing up would come from mutual friends. Still dependent on my mom for everything, he had begun a few half-baked plans that never worked out. But to me now, none of it counted. I turned my attention to my own life and gradually rebuilt the person I intended to be. I had no need to mend Tommy or change the heart of my mother. I needed to get well myself. A few months later, I visited a little beach town just to get away from everything and had the turning moment. To get away from the sounds of my life and reconnect with myself, I had reserved a cabin by the coast. I got an insight there, in the still solitude of the waters and the limitless heavens. I had spent so much of my life seeking love and approval from individuals unable to provide it for me. When all I had to do was learn to love and see myself, I had spent years attempting to demonstrate that I was worth loving, worth seeing. Looking into the horizon at that moment, I understood I didn't need to keep gazing at my family or past to define me. Without anybody else's permission, I could establish my own worth, my own happiness. I had never felt really at ease with who I was till now in my life. She was not a second-choice daughter. I was not the fixer either. That was plenty. I was Lily, just Lily. I rebuilt my life over time. I began to volunteer in ways that felt real to me. I started working for causes I cared about and developed friendships with individuals who appreciated me for who I was, not for anything I could do for them. I began to travel more, savoring the world outside the little, cramped place my family had let me occupy. I discovered how to welcome the silence rather than flee it, and how to love alone. I came to see that I just needed myself to feel fulfilled. I had no need for a poisonous family. Months after my self-directed separation from Tommy and Mom, one day I received a letter from her. It was not a contrition. It offered no justification. Written in her normal, guilt-ridden manner, it was a straightforward letter asking whether we might get together for coffee. She stated she wanted to write things and missed me. Old Tug, that part of me that had always yearned for her affection and acceptance, seemed to be present, but I no longer experienced despair. After much consideration, I came to the conclusion that I did not require closure from her. My need was to remain loyal to myself. I had already discovered inner serenity. Whatever she did or said, that peace was mine to preserve. I so elected not to reply. I didn't cut her off in wrath or obstruct her. I simply let her letter rest there as a constant reminder of how far I had come. I stopped feeling enraged. I was not wounded anymore. I was just ahead. I realized, for the first time in my life, that I could stand on my own, free from validation or acceptance from anyone else. Enough was spoken, and I had freedom as well. That turned out to be the true triumph, not only away from the poison of my family, but toward a day when I will no longer define myself by the people who never saw me. I had no one waiting to love me. I was learning to love myself, and in that love I discovered release,